Khandanam bhava bandhanam jaga bandhana bandit tamai niranjanam nararupam dhara niranjanam nararupam dhara nirgunam mochana agadushana jagadushanam chiddhana janam vimala nayana gyanan janam vimala nayana vikhanim moha janam yugala charana bhaktan Shampad Tav Sri Pad Bhav प्रेयमार्पण क्षमदर्शन प्रेयमार्पण क्षमदर्शन जग जन दुख जाय नमो नमो प्रभु वाक्य मनातीत नमो नमो प्रभु वाक्य मनातीत मन वचन एकाधार प्रभु मन वचन एकाधार ज्योतिर्ज्योतियो जल हृदि कंदर ज्योतिर्ज्योतियो जल हृदि कंदर तुमि तम भंजनहार प्रभु तुमि तम भंजनहार नमो नमो प्रभु वाक्य मनातीत नमो नमो प्रभु वाक्य मनातीत मन वचन एकाधार प्रभु मन वचन एकाधार ज्योतिर्ज्योतियो जल हृदि कंदर ज्योतिर्ज्योतियो जल हृदि कंदर तुमि तम भंजनहार प्रभु तुमि तम भंजनहार जय 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 लंग रंग भंग बाजे अंग शंग मृदंग जय 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 लंग रंग भंग बाजे अंग शंग मृदंग गाइछे छंद भक्त वृंद आरती तोमार गाइछे छंद भक्त वृंद आरती तोमार जय जय आरती तोमार हर हर आरती तोमार शिव शिव आरती तोमार खंडन भाव बंधन जग बंधन वंदे तमाय जय श्री गुरु महाराज जी की जय। ओम ह्रीं ऋतं त्वमचलो गुणजित् गुणेभ्यः नक्तं दिवं सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे यतोऽहं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारी गच्छन्तयलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वं वक्त्रोद्धृतोऽपि हृदये न मे भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो तेजस्तरन्ति तरसां त्वयि तृप्त तृष्णां रागे कृते ऋतपथे त्वयि राम कृष्णे मर्त्यामृतं तव पदं मरणोर्मि नाशम् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारे शान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं तु अशरणो जगदेकगम्यं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतार वरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ सर्वमङ्गल माङ्गल्ये शिवे सर्वार्थ साधिके शरण्ये त्र्यम्बके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टिस्थिति विनाशानां शक्ति भूते सनातने गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी नमोस्तुते। शरणागत दीनार्थ परित्राण परायणे सर्वस्यार्ति हरे देवी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय नारायणी Jaya Narayani Namostute Jaya Narayani Namostute. Jai Mahamai ki Jai, Jai Bhagwan Sri Ramakrishna Deva ki Jai, Jai Swami Ji Maharaj Ji ki Jai.
Namah Shri Atirajaya Vivekananda Sure Satchet Sukhasvarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. So we start with the next lecture of these Jnana-Yoga lectures of Vivekananda today. This is called The Absolute and the Manifestation. So the last three discussions were on this doctrine of Maya, which, as we discussed, is not supposed to be some kind of a theological or philosophical doctrine, but rather a close examination of the various contradictions that define our day-to-day existence. But these contradictions are with respect to what? That's the context of this particular lecture. And so there is this reference to the absolute. So essentially, if we want to relate the topic of this particular lecture to that of the Maya lectures, then what is manifest is summarized in particularly its contradictory terms as Maya. But then what's the relationship? I mean, if this existence is full of contradictions, if our day-to-day life is full of contradictions, what is it that is not? That's the question that one is trying to answer here. And he starts with a question. The one question that is most difficult to grasp in understanding the Advaita philosophy, and the one question that will be asked again and again, and that will always remain, is how has the infinite, the absolute, become the finite? Given the kind of heavy musical accompaniment that we are having from the left, I'm sure that we'll be interrupted in the midst of our discourse. So let me repeat that. How has the infinite, the absolute, become the finite? Yeah? This is the question that this particular lecture of Vivekananda attempts to explicate. I wouldn't say answer, because as with all these fundamental questions, the idea is not to get a clear formulaic answer, but rather it's an attempt to understand the problem and then grasp it through subjective introspection, analytical subjective introspection. That's the exercise towards which these lectures are guiding us. It's not some kind of intellectual doctrine or dogma that you are supposed to take away from these discussions. Because if it's some kind of philosophical dogma, some kind of philosophical conclusion, all that can do is add to one's burden. Yeah? See, basically, what are we trying to get at? We are trying to get at a certain principle of knowledge, a certain principle of unification. But if we just add to it one item, one more dogma, one more doctrine, it's going to be counterproductive. It's going to be exactly the opposite of the intent of these discussions. Yeah? Let me elaborate on that a little bit. I said principle of knowledge, principle of unification. What do we understand? Very common sense, human, day-to-day terms. What do we understand by knowledge? Say, for instance, let's give some example from, we've probably mentioned this before, but let's say the number 1 or the number 2. So in mathematics, these are called natural numbers. Apparently, these are numbers that occur in nature. 1, 2, 3, 4. You might have heard that the number 0, most unnatural number in certain sense, there was some Indian contribution to its discovery in the form of Aryabhatta. There was some earlier precursors in the Babylonian Sumerian civilization, and there were subsequent clarifications. However, when we speak of natural numbers, we speak of these numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. They're called natural because they're supposed to occur in nature. Now let me ask this very simple question. Does one see the number 1 in nature, the number 2, the number 3, 4, 5? And think about it a little bit. You see what? The accompaniment starts again. So you see one chair, one table, one person, one fan. You see 2 people, 2 chairs, 2 tables, 2 fans. What is common to one chair, one table, one person, one fan? That common piece of abstraction, that commonality, is exactly what is called the number 1. So similarly, what is common to 2 chairs, 2 tables, 2 fans, 2 people, or 2 persons, is the number 2. So what has our mind done? It has abstracted out from these concrete instances graspable by our senses of one person, one chair, one table, one fan, an abstraction, and that common abstraction is what we call the number 1. We symbolize it. In English, we put a straight line. In some Indian language, there's another notation for it. The notation is not important, the concept is. Similarly, the number 2. It's what is abstracted out from 2 apples, 2 oranges, 2 chairs, 2 tables. So, though these are called natural numbers, it's a first step of abstraction that the human mind performs on concrete sense objects. See, the point is, our brain is limited in size. So we can't quite put 2 physical chairs inside our head. The head's going to explode. So, but we can think of this abstraction called 2, and it's something that we can record in our brains. This capacity of the human mind for abstraction, a unifying principle, what is common to 2 chairs, 2 tables, 2 people, 2 apples, 2 oranges. This common piece of information is something that the human mind can abstract out and retain in his or her own head. And that abstraction is what we call 2. So, there is this capacity for abstraction which unifies individual pieces of information, individual pieces of sense data in a packet, in a small little packet that can be encoded in our heads. And this process of abstracting out and encoding is what we call the principle of knowledge. Take another example. Say an individual object, you lift it from this table, let it go, it will fall down. So also for a chair taken outside this room and allowed to fall to the ground. And so on and so forth. And there are all these various instances of various things which, when lifted to above the surface of the earth and allowed to go, it falls down. These are diverse phenomena, which we see around us in our day-to-day lives. What is it that unifies these things? That principle that unifies these things, as also the reason why the moon orbits the earth, why the earth orbits the sun, that principle is called gravity. Now, gravity is basically it's a law, which means that it's an abstraction. It's a way by which the human mind comprehends the external nature by abstracting out from these individual pieces of phenomena a certain principles, a certain abstract principle that we encode in our heads. So, again, it's a principle of knowledge, unifying falling of various objects on the surface of the earth to the earth, unifying also simultaneously the orbiting of the sun, of the earth around the sun or the moon around the earth. Again, it's a capacity of the human mind to abstract out from various different natural phenomena a principle of knowledge. This unification, this capacity for abstraction is exactly what we call the principle of knowledge. So when we are asking, or when this particular lecture starts by talking about the absolute, quote unquote, what is it trying to do? What it's trying to do is take all individual pieces of information, our entire life experience composed of these different phenomena, these different experiences, and then ask the question, what is it that unifies all of them? And the way this kind of Vedantic inquiry goes is that the individual I is regarded as the locus of these different individual pieces of information or individual pieces of knowledge. The attempt is to unify all of that into one single principle, And that is called absolute knowledge in that sense. Okay? So that's the attempt that one is trying to perform here. Fair enough. So the question then becomes, this unifying piece of knowledge, which is supposed to unify all one's phenomenal experiences in terms of phenomena, how did this absolute principle of knowledge become this variegated, multifarious, diverse kind of experience that we have today? How is it that the unified, non-dual principle of knowledge becomes dualized? That is the question that one is asking here. How has the infinite, the absolute, become the finite? That's the meaning of this question. I will now take up this question, and in order to illustrate it, I will use a figure. And Vivekananda has actually drawn a figure. It's a very simple figure. It says there's the absolute, and there's this manifestation, these two antipodes, and in between there is a lens. That lens is called time, space, and causation. Here is the absolute, A, and this is the universe, B. The absolute has become the universe. By this is not only meant the material world, but the mental world, the spiritual world, heavens and earths, and in fact, everything that exists. Mind is the name of a change, and body the name of another change, and so on. And all these changes compose our universe. This absolute A has become the universe B by coming through time, space, and causation C. This is the central idea of Advaita. Time, space, and causation are like the glass through which the absolute is seen. And when it is seen on the lower side, it appears as the universe. Now we at once gather from this that in the absolute there is neither time, space, nor causation. The idea of time cannot be there, seeing that there is no mind, no thought. The idea of space cannot be there, seeing that there is no external change. What you call motion and causation cannot exist where there is only one. We have to understand this and impress it on our minds that what we call causation begins after, if we may be permitted to say so, the degeneration of the absolute into the phenomenal, and not before. That our will, our desire, and all these things always come after that. See, here is a certain central point that Vivekananda is trying to make here. What is the condition of thought, the condition of perception of the world around us? These fundamental frameworks through which we look at the world and grasp it, understand it, the most abstract principles in a certain sense are time, space, and causation. Yeah? When we say that such and such a thing precedes another thing, then that means an event preceding another event is exactly what gives us this notion of time. Various events occurring, they have a certain sequence to them. That sequence is exactly what time is about. And when one event precedes another event, and you see that a certain kind of event continuously precedes another kind of event, we set up a relationship between those two, and that relation is what we call causation, a causal universe. Some event at a certain earlier point of time, invariably leading to another event at a certain other time. This is what causation is about. And we see, when we look around us, we see a three-dimensional world, and that's called space. So, without space, we cannot comprehend objects. Without time, we cannot comprehend events. And without causality, we cannot have a way of connecting one event to another. So, ontologically, as they say, as a structure, this notion of space, time, and causation precedes the perception of individual objects in space, precedes the observation of individual events in time, precedes a causal chain. So this causality, basically this notion of causation is an abstraction which precedes individual causal chains that we see in nature and infer a certain law. So this notion of time, space, causation is ontologically prior to the existence of individual events, individual objects in space, individual causal relationships. Now, this framework through which we grasp the world in its most general form then is taken out, abstracted, called time, space, causation. Question: are time, space, and causation themselves primaries? Are they not resolvable to something more fundamental? And that's the question that's being asked here. And to answer this, or to comprehend this question, see, time, space, what has been said so far is that time, space, and causation are the conditions for perceiving individual objects, individual events, individual causal relationships. But, question: where does time exist? Where does space exist? Where does causality exist? And I think the fairly naive answer to that is that these are ideas in our mind, but very deeply fundamental ideas. And so, instead of mind, one says that, look, it's in the individual consciousness that the notion of time arises. It's in the individual consciousness that the notion of space arises. It's in the individual consciousness that the idea of causal chain giving rise to connections between one event and another arise. Okay? But then, where is this individual consciousness? Something that is so general as time, space, and causation is not restricted to my time, my space, my causation. So, as soon as one says that it's in the individual consciousness that time, space, and causation arises, one is really asking for a kind of for an understanding of this word consciousness, which is general enough to be a substratum, so to speak, or the container of knowledge of time in the most general form, space in the most general form, causality in the most general form. Can that causation be limited by individual? When we speak of an individual, what we really mean is an individual conditioned by a particular body and mind. But here, we are looking at a certain foundational aspect of that mind which conceives of time, space, and causation. So an ontological prior to time, space and causation can only be consciousness in the most general form, not specific to an individual. An individual is aware of time, is aware of space, is aware of causal chains. But what is that aspect of him or her that is capable of grasping space, time, and causation? Since all differentiation necessarily succeeds or comes after these ideas of space, time, and causation, such consciousness can only be undivided, unconditioned by time, space, and causation. In other words, it cannot be conditioned by an individual body or an individual mind. This idea is indicated by this word, the absolute. What is the usual way we grasp the world? The usual way in terms is through our senses and then processing that information. So, the raw data, so to speak, comes through our senses and then we process it. And then we divide that stuff into categories and manage to go around passing that piece of information from one individual to another. So suppose we start from there. Suppose we start with our common sense view and understanding of the universe. This particular problem that has been stated here, how has the absolute become the manifest, how has the absolute become the finite, the multifarious world that we see? This is taking a standpoint from basically the point of view of the absolute consciousness, which we've tried to explicate here. But if we invert our point of view, suppose you start with, which is what we can really do, start with our common sense perception of the world around us, between this finite divided world around us, take that as the starting point. Then the question becomes, fair enough, you are starting with an external observer's point of view. And maybe try to analyze it in terms of various phenomena. Try to abstract out these pieces of knowledge from it. But one aspect of our awareness of the world eludes explanation. What is that? It is this subjective experience. See, there are two ways by which we can try to understand the world. One, the third person perspective, by which we try to objectively record various things in the world, and that becomes an objective piece of information that can be shared with others. The other is the opposite of that, namely the first person perspective, where subjective experience is of paramount importance. That's the primary. There is a gap between these two, third person experience and first person experience. So here the absolute points a finger to the essence of the first person experience in its most general form. Our usual way of grasping the world in terms of data gathered by the senses is passed on from one individual to another, and this third person perspective gives rise to another kind of knowledge, which is what we share, which is in its most refined form scientific knowledge as we know of it today. But between these two, where is the jump? So if you start with the third person perspective, the question becomes, how does this kind of phenomena this understanding of phenomena, how does that explain my subjective experience of the world around me? And if you start from, well, the subjective experience, then if subjective experience is the primary, then how is it that this world with all its finite forms exists? Either way, there is an explanatory gap. This passage from the third person perspective to the first person perspective and the explanatory gap there is today called the hard problem of consciousness. I mean, essentially, even if you are able to code and to code all different kinds of experience in terms of, say, pleasure, pain, etc., in terms of, say, nervous reactions, in terms of reactions of the brain, etc., even then, the fact that one subjectively experiences the world, this simple fact, bereft of individual experiences, don't put in the experience of an individual chair, individual mind, etc., but just this fact of experience, that without which we cannot move either, this particular element remains unexplained. This is called the hard problem of consciousness. And the other, essentially, if you take your stand on consciousness or the absolute, then how come then you have no explanation for the world? Yeah? This particular explanatory gap does exist in, I mean, that's a certain dimension of the conundrum that defines human existence today. So this particular lecture is going to take its standpoint that we start from consciousness and then try to understand this problem. How is this? I mean, how does that explain this world around us? Is there any explanation at all? So that's the question that we are going to try to understand during the rest of the discussions about this particular lecture. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.